The panel today, we have a very exciting panel. I'll be introducing them in just a minute. And I just want to tell you a little bit about what the panel today is going to be discussing. We'll be investigating the challenges faced by women, particularly low-income women, in availing economic opportunities. And we're going to propose strategies and interventions to enhance their safety, earning capacities, and overall empowerment. So it's a bit, our panel is spread out a little bit because we don't want to interrupt anyone's view. So what we're going to do is, pehle Dr. Zainab and Ms. Zahra are going to present, and then Dr. Maryam is sitting over there, and we have 3 discussants, Zainab, Rabia, and Maryam. So I'll introduce everyone, and then I'll hand over to Zainab and Zahra to present. So Dr. Zainab Latif is a senior fellow at Tabadlab. Her work focuses on rule of law, evidence-based criminal justice reform, and human rights. She has dealt with issues including women's incarceration, at-risk adolescents, and electoral participation. And Ms. Zahra Rao is a monitoring and evaluation associate at Tabadlab. She works on poverty graduation, community-driven development in rural areas, and women's economic empowerment and sustainable livelihoods. Please join me in welcoming them both. So, shall I introduce everyone and then we can hand over to you? Okay. Dr. Maryam Mustafa is Assistant Professor of Computer Science at LUMS. And she runs the Interactive Media Lab at LUMS, and she's the director of GenTech, the Gender and Technology Research Cluster, and the Saeed Wahid Gender Center, which are both housed here at LUMS. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Maryam. And we have 3 fantastic discussants here today. Dr. Rabia Kamal, who is Assistant Professor of Anthropology at LUMS. Her research brings together scholarship on cultural and visual anthropology, digital technologies, and surveillance, and racialization and gender politics in South Asia and the United States. Her current research is a multi-sited ethnography located at the nexus of social media and social justice in urban Pakistan. Next, we have Ms. Zainab Saeed, who is Director, Research Marketing and Communications at Karandaaz, Pakistan. She's a gender and finance specialist who has worked for nearly 2 decades on design and implementation of financial inclusion programs, and has expertise in market research, business development, gender mainstreaming initiatives, and advocacy interventions for mindset change. And finally, we have Ms. Maryam Umar, who is the founder and president of Women's Digital League, which provides digital literacy training and work to Pakistani women. She works in the online digital outsourcing sphere for economic empowerment of women, and has served as the project manager for Women X, a World Bank-supported training program for women in business. Welcome to everyone. So I'm going to hand off to Dr. Zainab. She's going to be laying the stage for us with regard to women's labor in Pakistan. They've done some very exciting work in major and smaller urban centers.
Thank you. So just very quickly, you can see the title, Motivations and Resilience, Working Women in Small Town Pakistan. And the research is important. I don't think we need to get into it about why female labor force participation in Pakistan is much lower than it is in other places. And the story in small towns is different from what it is in the major cities. We know that this is a huge opportunity in terms of increasing GDP and economic growth to increase female labor force participation. But Zahra and I together were doing some research in what we call small town Pakistan, so basically not Islamabad, Lahore, Karachi. And we came across many women who were really inspiring in how they worked and how they overcame the challenges that they were facing. And Zahra and I would again and again talk about how difficult it was to work in those circumstances, and we were really in awe of how they were surmounting the barriers. And again we would ask each other, "Ki ye kaise karte hain?" Like, how do they do it? So this research is basically our attempt to ask that question, "Ki ye kaise karte hain?" So before I start, I just want to have a quick show of hands, please. मैं एक सवाल करूँगी उर्दू में और आप लोगों ने बस हाथ उठा के उसका जवाब देना है, ठीक है? सवाल ये है कि क्या काम करना औरत का हक है? जो समझता है कि काम करना औरत का हक है, वो ज़रा ऊपर तक हाथ उठाए ताकि हम ठीक है, क्या काम करना औरत का हक है? So I would say, Zahra, what, about 75-80%? Okay. 75-80% of people in this room, men and women together, think that काम करना औरत का हक होता है. And in the group that we were talking to, it was 50%. So we're talking to working women, but they themselves believe कि ये औरत का हक, many of them believe कि ये औरत का हक नहीं होता. Right? So think about what they're up against. जब आपको अपने में faith नहीं है, या you don't feel like you belong in the workplace, so what the types of challenges that you're having to deal with. So we converted this, obviously being researchers, we converted this into some research questions also. These are the two research questions that we had, and the definitions are at the bottom. What motivates women to work, and how do working women persist through hostile and challenging conditions? And the definition of how we define motivation and resilience is right here. So I'm going to hand over to Zahra, who will talk about the sample a little bit.
So hi, everybody. I'm quickly going to take you through our sample size. So we decided to go with snowball sampling, and we spoke to 24 women between the ages of 20 to 40. All of them had completed their BA, and many of them had, in fact, completed 2 masters. And one thing common between all of these 24 women was that they were not living in major cities of Pakistan. Now, what do we mean when we say they weren't living in major cities of Pakistan? I mean, they were living in Karak, they were living in Kohat, Turbat, Bahawalpur, Gwadar, Peshawar, Quetta. So a majority of our respondents were from these areas. When we looked more closely at them, 17 of them were single. Half of them, as I said, we conducted snowball sampling. Half of them worked in NGOs. We did have a criteria to exclude some people, and that included that we will not be speaking to women. We do not want respondents who are not living within Pakistan, who have lived abroad at some point, who have less than 2 years of experience, who are highly paid. And with all of this data, how did we go about? What was our methodology? We started with 50 hours of telephonic interviews. With that data, we coded it on NVivo across 20 themes. Then we decided to use 4 themes to analyze the data we found from those codes. So what are those 4 themes? We begin with self, and that's our framework for the analysis. So we begin with self, we go on to family, then we go on to workplace, and eventually community. So that's how our methodology started from self and went on to community. I'm going to talk very briefly about motivations. So what exactly does motivate these women? Like Zainab said, these are women not in Islamabad, Lahore. Well, one of them was from Lahore, but a majority of these women are from really periphery areas, really marginalized areas, and they're working against all odds. So what motivates them? We see that there are 3 themes across which we understand their motivation. First off, personal ambition. So they wanted an identity for themselves, not to be recognized through their fathers, through their brothers. Secondly, there's always the aspect of financial independence. Not only did they gain respect from gaining this financial independence, but they also had greater agency to express taste. Deciding, yes, this is the kind of dress I want to buy. This is, I want to sleep at this time and I don't want to sleep. I want to get this for my child and I don't want to get this for my child. The second theme was family. Financial pressure was one of the major reasons why women were stepping out of the comforts of their homes or the comforts of outside of their homes. So financial pressure is one reason why many of us work. So that is one reason why women were going out, but then they had, through this motivation, they had the opportunity to support their kids, support their parents, and supplement family income. And on the same, at the other hand, they found lots of support, in some cases, and in some cases lack of support, from members within the family. This included, so if they had supportive brothers, supportive husbands, supportive fathers, if male members within the households were supportive, they found that they were able to really accomplish things, and that added to their motivation to work. Finally, when we talk about community, we found that women from really not just marginalized, but even periphery areas within Pakistan, they had this motivation to use their studies to benefit, to bring some kind of change within their communities. And like we saw under the theme of family, within the theme of community, they found support around them. But this time, not in terms of household members, but they found role models, so their teachers or older relatives who found that they were able to, so these respondents were able to find support within them, who supported them in terms of education, in terms of working. One thing I'd like to draw your attention to is that little corner on the top right of the slide. Well, yeah, right. So our framework of analysis has 4 themes. But there's one theme missing in that, and that is workplace. So we found that there were no motivational factors within these, the data shared by the respondents when it came to workplace. And I'd like for you all to keep that in mind, because it seems like it's not that the women are going out of their homes, they're going to work, and they find motivation in that, in the sense that they want to continue to work because they like, they're looking for a promotion or something within the workplace affair. So I'm going to hand over to Zainab to talk a little bit about the challenges they faced.
So I'm actually going to focus on the resilience factors, but much as we want to get away from that negative discourse around all of this, we can't really understand the resilience factors until we talk about the challenges. So just very quickly, the challenges that the women, that the respondents raised, we've tried to organize them or kind of show you the size of the font to display what was coming up more in our conversations. Again, this is qualitative research, so there's no point in showing you percentages of this, but it's really the narrative and the story that we want to pull out. So the commute, public harassment, gender discrimination at the workplace, and workplace harassment. These were the things that were coming out to be a little bit louder. These were the challenges that they were facing. As opposed to, say, for example, the social backlash, which was something less loud in their responses. But the commute led to a lot of other complications. So they felt like not only is it creating opportunities for harassment while you're at the bus stop or while you're walking on the street, but also, again I'm going to slip into Urdu, कि लोगों को जो बात करने का मौका मिलता है ना, वो commute की वजह से मिलता है. Because अक्सर जो लोग बातें बनाते हैं, वो इस वजह से बनाते हैं कि आपका मर्दों के साथ interaction हो रहा है. और वो जो commute का जो interaction है, वो शायद बहुत ज़्यादा एक risky एक aspect है इसका. So a lot of women talked about the commute as being a major challenge. Then of course, with regard to the family over there, we saw that permission from the family is hard to obtain. It's not a given that you're going to have permission to work at all, far from it. And the ostracization was something that came up repeatedly, not from the immediate family, but from the extended family. Mamus, funnily enough, were repeatedly cited for being ostracizing, and in-laws for permission to work. Mental health also came up as a challenge, but a minor one, not a major one. Okay, so having said that, we can go to the resilience factors. And this is really the crux of it, because this is really what we were out to see, कि ये लोग करते क्या हैं. So I'm going to again start with community, because I think this is perhaps one of the areas where we see some really creative strategies taking place, relatively creative. So optimizing the commute, so women are trying to do whatever they can to solve those commute hurdles. They're sort of coming together, sort of, making their own little networks, and using their friends to stay in touch digitally. If I'm taking a taxi, I'll text my friend and tell her I'm taking a taxi, so that I'm not alone. And so on and so forth. They're using whatever social network they have. It's not very extensive. In fact, they themselves are providing a lot of opportunities to other people. But they're using the social networks that they have to find out about other opportunities, etc. They're over in the workplace, they're self-advocating. Often they don't have anyone to advocate for them, so they're doing a lot of it for themselves, much more so than, for example, Zahra and I would have to do in a setting like this, where there's many others who are willing to be our allies. They're directly intervening, so as opposed to relying on workplace harassment policies, they themselves are using whatever sort of knowledge they have, their networks, their relationships, to counter challenges related to harassment. And a lot of times they're just employing indifference, right? Ignoring a lot of issues that they face, both with regard to commute and with regard to the workplace. Another thing I want to just bring to your attention is the channeling of male allies. So family can be a barrier, but without getting that support, it's very hard for them to move forward. Now, given our sample, almost all of them reported that they had either a husband or a father or a brother who was their champion, who had really helped push them forward. So they're using those allies as and when they can. And with regard to self, I mean, we saw a number of things, but one of the things that I think was most evident is that they had to project confidence, and they adapted traits which they themselves said कि मैं आदमी बन गई हूँ, मैं आदमी बन के काम करती हूँ, which is basically what we in our language would say confident or masculine traits. They were adopting those just to be able to get by in their day-to-day. So all of this, and just very quickly, what does this mean? So just very quickly, there's a couple of things that I think we should remember about this. Some are consistent with the literature on urban areas and other countries, but some are, I think, a little bit more pertinent to the small town context. The right to work is not a given. So don't forget the negotiation that these women have to take place and the creative strategies they have to employ to actually be able to negotiate. That's related to the third point. Financial autonomy helps that negotiation. Family, as I said, especially male family, is limiting, but it is crucial. But I think with regard to policy implications, there are two aspects which we need to keep in mind. First, that motivations do not stem from the workplace. So workplace incentivizing and subsidies to employers to be able to take women employees can actually be really helpful, because right now it's a lacuna. It's not someplace that's even being thought about in terms of encouraging women to work. And the second was, again, consistent with the literature, commute is the main constraint. And that's a very fixable problem in the sense that, it's a structural constraint that, obviously there are fiscal implications, but it's not something that is amorphous, right? Okay, I'll end there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Zainab. And I think this really lays out the stage for the next presentation. So Dr. Maryam is going to be presenting our work, which is at Gender Tech. And at Gen Tech, we really explore the intersection between gender, technology, and how we can really leverage technology to socially, economically empower women.
Thank you. So I hope this is the right slides. We've kept editing them right until 10 minutes ago. So many copies on this. So fingers crossed we have the right one. Yeah, so as Dr. Hadia's mentioned, she and I co-direct the Gender and Technology Research Cluster at LUMS. And as most of you know, Hadia is an economist, I'm a technologist. So it's a really interesting marriage in terms of our research areas. I work on gender and technology. She works on women's economic empowerment and labor participation. And so a lot of our work has been around understanding how to create digital support mechanisms to enable economic and social empowerment. And some of the things that we've sort of ideated on speak directly to what Dr. Zainab was saying earlier, particularly in terms of commute. So before I get into our own work, I'm going to very quickly, hopefully, lay out the context, because I think it's really, really important to contextualize all of the work. Pakistan, as most of you might know, places 151 out of 153 countries on the 2020 Gender Gap Index, and this has not changed in the 2022 index either. We're in the bottom 3. And so this includes what the index looks at is economic participation, political participation, health and well-being, all of those metrics, and we are in the bottom 3 across the board. Only 6% of women in Pakistan have more than a secondary school education, and 78% have no education. It's also important to contextualize our work with the mobile penetration in Pakistan. So across the board in this region, Pakistan has the highest gender gap when it comes to mobile phone use adoption, okay? And just to give you sort of a sense of what the mobile internet journey looks like, what you'll see here is mobile ownership, mobile internet awareness, internet adoption, regular and diverse mobile internet use. And as you can see, and this is the data for Pakistan, and this is the 2023 data from GSMA for Pakistan. Women do worst in all of the categories, particularly in mobile phone ownership, internet adoption, regular use, regular and diverse use. So what's really interesting here is that they're at par with men when it comes to mobile internet awareness. So it's really not a factor of कि उनको पता नहीं है. They know, they're aware, not just of what a mobile phone does, but of the internet and what it can give them access to. It's in all the other areas that there is a significant gender gap still. And we'll get into today a little bit about why we have that gap still. So in all of our work, so these are some of the questions that Hadia and I have been interested in exploring, and we have a lot of data across different projects that address some of this, and I'll talk briefly about some of this. You can go and read our papers for more details on each of this, or you can just ask us questions at the end, and we're happy to answer those. So we've been interested in understanding how do women find work and navigate leaving home for work. So we've looked at the literacy rates for women in Pakistan. Clearly, these women are not on LinkedIn, right? They're not Googling. They're not reading newspapers to find jobs. So how are they finding jobs? How do they know which factory has a position available? How do they know which factory ka mahal acha hai, right? How are they navigating that? How are they navigating permission to leave home to go work in a factory or in somebody's home? What are their experiences of sexual harassment in transit and at work? Its associated stigma and the impact on their economic empowerment. As Dr. Zainab has very detailed laid out, one of the biggest issues women face once they step outside the home for work is actually harassment in all forms. And we'll see our data shows, it's a bit shocking when you look at the codes on Atlas that it's harassment at the workplace, harassment on the street, harassment in a rickshaw, and harassment in places of worship. So wo masjidon mein bhi ho rahi hai. What are women's constructs of a safe space? So how are they creating these safe spaces on the go? How are they working? What are the mechanisms they're employing to create safe spaces, not just at the work and at home, but in transit? How do women's work intersect with their access to digital technologies to affect their economic and social lives? And we're also particularly interested in exploring existing technologies that have been aimed for women's economic empowerment, particularly financial inclusion. Do they work? Do they not work? If they're not working, why they're not working? These are the 3 projects that have addressed this work. Over the course of the last 2 years, we've interviewed, and these are detailed qualitative interviews, so these are not surveys. Semi-structured qualitative interviews, about 45 minutes to 60 minutes long, 250 women over 3 years across 4 provinces, 10 districts, and we've looked at home-based workers, factory workers, and SME workers. All right, so one of our first projects was really trying to understand how do women find work, how do they get to work, and what happens once they reach work. For this, we interviewed 63 female factory workers in Lahore and Faisalabad. And we coded the data up in Atlas. What we're finding is that low-income, low-literate women struggle to enter the workforce due to restrictions on mobility, lack of access to job vacancies, lack of access to any platform that lets them know when jobs are available, and as Dr. Zainab mentioned, the commute that is required to get to work. How do they get to work safely? How they're finding work is through their social networks, and there are 2 that they're leveraging. Female relatives, female friends, and the male relatives that they have. Now, clearly, the male relatives ensure that these women work in factories where they already have a relative working. So their preference is to ensure that women, when they're working in factories, they go to a factory where there is a male relative present to sort of monitor and surveil. The challenge is that their limited physical mobility means that the quality and context and extent of their social network is poor and limited. And this impacts not just the breadth of their job search, but also the quality and the quantity of jobs that are available to them. So just the act of stepping outside the home to work requires a very long negotiation for most women. This is a quote from one of our participants, and this is very representative of the kind of data that we've gathered from all 63 women. When my job started, my husband, my chachu, my elder brothers, the shopkeeper in front of our house owner, they all sat together to discuss that I want to do a job. And this is not an anomaly. This is not an extreme data point. When we talk about harassment and safety in transit, what we're seeing is that women experience some form of harassment everywhere. Now, the numbers don't really tell you much because keep in mind, this is qualitative data, this is not quantitative data. But just to give you an idea, we had reports of harassment on rickshaws, vans, foot, in workplaces, in factories, work commutes, and places of worship. There are 2 main ways in which women are dealing with harassment. The first, it is not that big of a deal. He touched you and ran away. Only you know he did that. Calling the police means more people will find out. So you do nothing. You stay quiet. You ensure you don't make a fuss. The second thing that we found, and it was interesting how much of these quotes we found, and I think this speaks to, for me as a technologist, this is an interesting sort of insight into design. I gathered all the passerby. I told him, offender, that he didn't know who I was. He kept on saying, sorry, sorry. So this reliance on standard bias, this reliance on support from the community to address harassment in transit. The other thing we found is how women are creating safety in transit is A, by relying on bystander support, and B, by traveling with older women. So when they wait outside the factory, and in a chingchi or a rickshaw, they'll wait for older women, and then they'll take that rickshaw. So they're relying on the community of older women who are more vocal, and they're more willing to call out harassment where they see it. Now, one of the more interesting insights that we found in all our work, and you'll see this in the other two projects as well, is this really interesting trade-off that happens between phone ownership and work. I don't have a mobile, so no one is interested in me. They will say she's the one who started something. If something wrong happens, then the blame will be on me. So if you're stepping outside the home to work, you willingly, or by coercion, are having to give up access to a mobile phone. So you're having to give up some of the digital space in order to access your physical workspace. And we ran more interviews to explore this intersection between the digital and the physical space, and we spoke to 107 female home-based and domestic workers and factory workers in Lahore, Kasoor, Faisalabad, Quetta, and Karachi. And what we found is that home-based workers have greater ownership of phones, 72 here, internet access and use of different digital platforms compared to both domestic and factory workers. So women who stay inside the home have more access to digital spaces. Their use is more diverse and more prolific. If you're stepping outside the home, what you're being told is, my husband told me that if I were to work in a mill, then he would not give me a phone. I wasn't to put on henna or lipstick. Again, this is not an anomaly. This is kind of an average quote that's coming from women who were stepping outside the home to work. However, the women who have made that trade-off, they're finding enhanced earning capacities. So we had one woman say, I don't know why my husband is a daily wage laborer. I don't know why he's going out to work. I keep telling him he doesn't need to. I sit at home and sell cloth on WhatsApp. And I make so much money that he can just sit at home and chill. Home-based workers who've made that trade-off, okay, so it's been a while since I've left that job, and what I'm doing right now is very respectable. I'd buy clothes, bring them home, my cousins come and purchase this from me. I bought my products online, upload their pictures as my WhatsApp status, and sent their rates to my cousins. I share my factory story with my sisters, and they said it's better to starve at home than working in such an environment. Women who now have access to phone, who've made that trade-off, are also finding enhanced social connections. And what those social connections are doing is giving them access to other women, other ways of thinking, other choices, and other access to thoughts, other thoughts or ways of existing and being and doing. And we'll get to that hopefully towards the end. Now the last project that I'm going to talk about very briefly is one that we did in collaboration with Kashf, the MFI Foundation. And what they did was they wanted to shift and they wanted to explore the use of mobile wallets for giving out loans to their female clients. For this, we looked at female clients in Lahore, Chinnot, and Jung. All three places had branches where mobile wallets had been rolled out. So what they'd done is they'd had women come into their branches where they had given them SIMs and they had registered them on mobile wallets and they'd given them a brief training on how to use these mobile wallets. We spoke to 49 female loan clients and 30 staff personnel. This is some of the participant data. The monthly household income ranged from 52,000, 40,000, and 60,000. What we found is that there's a big challenge with SIM registration and phone ownership. Once women come into the Kashf branches, उनको जब register करने लगते हैं SIM के लिए, तो उनको पता चलता है 5-6 और family members ने उनके नाम पर SIMs निकलवाई हुई हैं, and there is a limit to how many SIMs you can have in your name. The other big issue that happens is that fingerprints aren't detected, and so sometimes it takes an hour or 2 hours to register a SIM for a woman. Participants living in rural areas shared that their community was not accepting of women using mobile phones, so how are they then going to use mobile wallets? And then the other big problem was literacy. Because आपके ऊपर जो सारे messages आ रहे हैं, they're in Urdu and they're in text. And then women can't, it's not speech, it's not audio, it's text. They can't read this. And so what happens then is that they take this to the shop, and the shop guy says, text nahi aaya. And then he'll keep the money himself. Or he says, कि सिर्फ इतने पैसे transfer हुए, and women are telling us, field staff and women both are telling us a percentage they'll keep. And so these scams become, once shopkeepers realize the women themselves can't read and they don't understand what's happening, it's really easy to scam them. And the other big problem and challenge that I think the Kashf as an organization also faced was restrictions on withdrawing more than 50,000 PKR in a single transaction. Now, Kashf had worked with a telco to ensure that the first 2 transactions, there were no costs incurred for women. But after that, they work, and it wasn't a significant amount for us, but previously, जब वो बैंक से जाकर ले रही थी, there was no cost. They could get the full 100,000, 150,000 in one go, and they had their cash right there. So, but what was also interesting is, I'm going to take one more minute because I find this really interesting. And this is really what we were interested in finding. As a technologist, I was interested to see कि अगर एक organization आपको forcefully एक mobile wallet पे register कर देती है, और आपकी अब मजबूरी है उसको यूज़ करना because आपने उससे लोन के पैसे निकलवाने हैं और उसमें आपने अपनी जो किस्त है वो भरनी है. Are there other things you now use? Because you're being forced to use one thing. Are there any spillover effects in what else you might use? And we found that we did find some spillover effects, where out of 17 participants who owned a smartphone, 6 said they'd started using mobile wallets to accept business-related payments from clients. 13 started using mobile wallets for both sending and receiving funds from family and friends. 4 started using mobile wallets to save their money, and 4 started using mobile wallets for paying their utility bills. So there is some evidence that if women are forced to use, and it's become acceptable, right? कि आप अगर एक business set up कर रहे हो, and आपकी family के structure में भी, it's a little bit more acceptable for you to have a phone, because now Kashf mandates that you have a phone and that you have a mobile wallet. And so अगर आपको loan भी उसी पर मिलना है, तो फिर वो ज़रूरत है, and it's no longer an issue of contention in the household. And then you have these spillover effects where you start to use it more. Now, my understanding from all of this work over the last several years is that one of the things that, and this quote is from Naila Kabir, one of the ways in which I understand empowerment or power is the ability to make choices. To be disempowered implies a denial of choice. And I think what mobile phones and access to the internet does is it gives women choices. It gives them access to social networks. It gives them access to mechanisms for saving. It gives them access to ways to be financially independent, to set up their own businesses. And the ways women have done this is extraordinary. Where वो पढ़ लिख नहीं सकती, लेकिन वो WhatsApp का status use कर रही हैं चीज़ें बेचने के लिए, right? They're not even setting up Instagram pages or Facebook pages. They're using WhatsApp status messages to sell things, and they're being very successful doing this. And I really think that that's one of the ways that we can leverage tech to ensure women's social and economic empowerment.
Thank you, Maryam. So could I request the discussants to... Right, so we'll do round 1. I'll request each of the discussants to comment on the presentations that have been made in light of your own experiences, your own fieldwork. You bring a wealth of experience to this room. So I'll start with Rabia, and then we'll have Zainab, and then we'll have Maryam.
Thank you to everybody, especially Dr. Hadia, for bringing and convening this together and for inviting me to be a discussant. There's so much food for thought, I think, in both. I've read the papers and after listening to the conversation. So I do feel like some of my questions or thoughts will be a bit scattered. My own research specifically focuses on digital spaces, so I think I'm trying to make a connection between questions around access and culturally specific tech design or thoughts about design. So these are just kind of observations that emerge. The first is directed at Dr. Zainab's Zahra's presentation. One of the things, and again, this is related maybe specifically to representation and your research population, was that one of the things that stood out to me was that 17 out of the 24 people you interviewed were single, which I thought was an interesting maybe something that you could possibly comment on when you speak to that. Just because I think that kind of relates to this question of choice, right? Or this notion of choice. Why are women working? What are their motivations? And so it was significant to me, that particular statistic. Secondly, when you were speaking about this idea of supportive male relatives, right? I was also really interested in that particular idea because when I think about, obviously my context is very, very different and I have a certain level of privilege, but for example, my husband supports that I teach, right? But even this notion of support comes with a lot of different sort of culturally imbued ideas about guilt and obligation and sort of being grateful for the fact that I have this support, right? So that sort of nuance and dimension is important to me. And then speaking to Dr. Maryam's and Hadia, Dr. Hadia's research, one of the things as an anthropologist and an ethnographer that sort of comes to mind for me is this question of limitations that come with just doing interviews. Obviously, again, given the fact that access is an issue, and you had said this in your paper. You'd mentioned in several of your papers that women are reluctant to speak about their use of phones, and they're reluctant to speak about how much money they earn or just money in general, right? One of the things I find really interesting in my own research is the discrepancy between what people say and then what they're able to do, right? So some of the kind of negotiations that women will make, either through strategically, sometimes I think, reinforcing gender norms, right, as a form of agency, which is, again, related to sort of anthropological research that questions our notions of agency and choice, and how we apply that, I think, is important. So, and then finally, sorry, I don't want to, there's so much that I'm raising. I'm sorry if it's a bit scattered. My own interest then, in particular with regards to your research, is this question of once you do get access to digital spaces and mobile phones, I'm wondering what are the possibilities, but also restrictions of digital mobility or mobilities, right? So once you're on these spaces, I mean, some of this is very important, right? Sort of thinking more specifically about culturally specific tech design that transcends both or addresses gender and class, right? I think that's really important because sometimes when people are talking about, for example, culturally sensitive AI, they will talk about gender, but the intersection of gender and class, I think, is very important. But then also moving away from romanticizing the digital, or at least being a little bit more critical about how we think about the restrictions that come with having access to the digital. So, for example, ideas around sort of surveillance capitalism, the commodification of data personal data that has implications for different vulnerable populations. I know that might be a leap because these women oftentimes are still trying to get to the access first, right? But I think if we're thinking about tech design, that's something that we need to consider as well. And then in particular, I'd like you to, and this is my last point, sort of speak about this kind of physical and digital, this dichotomy between physical mobility and digital mobility. I'm curious to know whether you think this dichotomy may in fact reinforce certain kinds of power structures even as they transcend them, right? So this idea of if you stay home, you can have access to the digital based on the home-based workers that you've done or that you've spent time working with. And sort of also pushing back against the idea of, those who do sort of cede control of digital spaces, they're kind of, it's like a bargain of patriarchy, right? Is this falling into sort of the false consciousness rhetoric that you often hear, like these women, because they choose the physical over the digital, are they in some ways kind of giving up on certain understandings or avenues of empowerment? So, bless you. So yeah, I will leave it there. Again, maybe in the second round we can speak about this more. And again, apologies for the sort of scattered feedback, but it was all really wonderful, and I'm really excited to hear the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rabia. How about Dr. Zainab? You can comment, and then we'll move on to the other discussants. Is that fine? Yeah, because Rabia has given us lots of. So then we can comment on that, and then we'll move on. Yeah.
बिल्कुल ठीक है. I think your 2 points are very well taken. I agree that this marital status has a lot to do with it. As I said, it was a snowball samples, and it so happened that our networks tend to be more single, I suppose, than married. So, but yes, I do think that has implications for choice. The other thing to keep in mind is that our sample was entirely working women, but it was entirely first generation working women, women whose mothers had not been working, right? So that's where the dynamic that we were interested in exploring. The responses, interestingly enough, between the 7 who were married and the 17 who were not married were not significantly different. So their motivations and their challenges and their resilience strategies were very similar. But at the same time, the onus of choice, I think, and I call it the onus of choice on purpose, that onus of choice, I think, differs across those 2 groups that you've mentioned. With regard to the supportive male relatives, absolutely. We do look at this from a point of view of privilege, but we weren't able, it was telephonic interview, so we weren't able to get to that nuance ke, again, forgive me, kaun jatata hai aur kaun nahi jatata. It's never blanket permission. It's also blanket support. It's also never कि अच्छा मैं बच्चों का ख्याल रख लेता हूँ तुम काम पे चली जाओ. No, it's not that. हाँ, काम बच्चों का ख्याल फिर भी आपकी अम्मा रखेंगी. It's only permission कि आप जाके काम कर सकती हैं. It's literally only that level of permission that we're talking about. And we didn't have the ability to really sort of delve more deeply into it. But your points are very well taken.
If I could add a small thing to that, I think with privilege, there came also other areas which were highlighted within, so areas which the family felt were a little uncomfortable. So most of our respondents weren't very well-to-do, but those who were, even they struggled with if a male family relative, if a father has allowed that woman to work and also is supporting her financially, but there's still a lot of areas where herself, things that come under the theme of self in our framework, she was constantly struggling with that. So a lot of these single women, it's interesting that you brought that up because a lot of these single women were scarred. And they were like, we've started working and we're very conscious about that because when we do get married, we're already thinking about whether we'll have the permission to work, continue to work as well.
Great, thank you. Dr. Maryam?
तो भूल भी गई. Sorry, no. They were so well crafted. No, I remember bits and pieces. So I think it's Rabia, your point on class and gender is very well taken, right? When we talk about class, there are a bunch of things associated with it. एक तो mobile phone ownership नहीं है, literacy नहीं है, right? And that's a function of their class. And so, in our design, we don't, as one of the things in moving to Pakistan that I've sort of had to learn and relearn and figure out is how to create technology designs that are not top-down. And so what we do are what are called participatory design workshops, which means that we sit down with the women that we're designing for and we have them design for themselves. And what I'm finding is that, and this speaks also to your point about the physical and the digital mobilities, that these women are very, very, very capable of making their own choices. They don't need me or anybody else coming to tell them, oh, you should have opted for the digital choice, because it's a very well thought out choice that they've made. And so for whatever reason, they've chosen the physical mobility over digital mobility, and that works for them. So it's not so much that they're giving up on certain things, which sure they are, but if they were to, in their circumstances and for their situation, had they chosen the digital option and stayed at home, maybe that would have been a worse choice for them. So it is a very well thought out choice on their part. With respect to class and gender in design, one of the things we're finding is that to make commute safer, one of the things that we really should be looking at a policy level is not looking at personal devices, but looking at embedded devices. So embedding devices on your public buses and your bus stands to alert passerbys, to imagine if you were standing at a bus stop and you got an alert on your phone that said that there's somebody in your vicinity who's being harassed but is unable to protect her. So one of the things we're finding is that when older women rely on passerbys and jab wo shor machati hain, so the men around them are very supportive, right? So they'll step in and they'll stop it, and there's a certain amount of protection that happens. And so can you leverage embedded devices to create safe spaces for women in transit? Can you create tools and applications that are speech-based, that allow low-literate women to carpool? Abhi because unke social networks limited hain, so they don't really know कि उनके मोहल्ले से एक factory में कौन जा रहा है. They don't know. They only know साथ वाले घर में maybe or left right या शायद सामने वाले घर में. But if there was a way to create carpooling options for rickshaws and public transport for women going to work from the same neighborhoods, and to create these digital communities of women that is speech-based, it's not text, it's speech-based. One of the most ubiquitous used platforms in Pakistan is actually WhatsApp, because हमारी जो low literate population है वो speech के through communicate कर सकती है. They don't require text on WhatsApp. WhatsApp के privacy issues बहुत ज़्यादा हैं for women. That's an entirely different conversation. But if you could create speech-based communities that allowed women to connect over work, that allowed them to understand factories ka mahal, that allowed older women to share their own learnings about how to protect themselves in factories, the mechanisms that there is none of that knowledge is being transferred, it's not being archived, there's no. So those are some of the things that we're exploring in terms of class and gendered tech design to support these women. But all of this comes from these own women. You know, we spoke to a group of women. We were trying to understand what a voice-based speech network would look like. And so if there was just a phone number that they could call and they could relate their stories, they could relate their experiences of finding work or working in a factory. And we'd said that, okay, you know, to make sure that this was anonymous, हमने एक prototype बनाया, उसमें हमने उनकी voice को morph किया. And the women said that, what is this nonsense? I want my voice to sound like my voice. Because जब मैं एक कहानी सुना रही हूँ, उसमें एक emotional valence है, और आपने इसमें filter लगाकर उसको खराब कर दिया है. And we said, अच्छा फिर हम इसको anonymize कैसे करें? And she said, मैं अपने मोहल्ले से और इस geographic region से बाहर नहीं जाती. ना मैं इससे बाहर किसी को जानती हूँ. So just make sure my story is available outside of this geographic region. That is not something that had occurred to us. And so these women we find are fully capable of designing and creating tech for themselves. We just need to enable them to do that.
All right, thank you. Zainab.
Hi. So yeah, great papers. I had the pleasure of reading the both of them, both the papers today while I was traveling from Islamabad to Lahore. And I think they make very pertinent points. And I think, you know, your paper specifically, Zahra and Zainab, you know, it tells the story of so many women that we know. I mean, I've been in the female labor force for about 16 years now, and I've worked with a lot of women, and you know, it really really spoke to me, and there weren't many surprises really. So I mean, it was really interesting to kind of look at it and to read it and to engage with it. And I think the part that hurt the most, I think, was the fact that none of the motivators were coming from the workplace. And you know, this is despite us being in 2023, right? And this is despite, I saw that your sample was overwhelmingly from NGOs, you know, and the NGOs all sign on to, you know, gender policies and, you know, gender mainstreaming in their workforce and things like that. So that's something that was not surprising, but I think most hurtful as a female worker in Pakistan, right? And I think this kind of takes me back to some of the work that I've done with really big corporates also, and you know, really large institutions that are trying to get women, you know, so they get women in, and they get women in at the you know, early sort of field level or, you know, associate level jobs, but they find it very difficult to grow them and to take them, you know, up to even managers, and then C-suite pe to bahut kam hote hain. And the pipeline that you have, you know, it's 50-50 generally, you know, across the world also, in Pakistan also. In the associate level, and as you go to C-suite, it comes down to about 4 to 5%. So one of the things that, you know, I in a last life used to work on with HR managers and with CEOs was the understanding of second generation biases. So वो पहली generation bias तो ये था कि जी आपने ख़वातीन को workplace में लाना ही नहीं है. So you know, the women were not allowed to work, which we are still fighting with, as we know from your paper and your papers and the more qualitative side of it. That वो अभी भी choice जो है, जिसको आप onus of choice बड़े अच्छे, you know, that's a very sort of nice way of putting it, you know, कि क्या ख़वातीन काम कर सकती हैं, ये एक right है कि नहीं, हम इस पे भी जो है अभी confusion में हैं. लेकिन जो पहला first generation bias था वो ये था कि जी ख़वातीन ने काम ही नहीं करना, और उसको शायद हमने break कर दिया. But now we're at a point where, you know, things like double binds, things like lack of female sponsors, things like lack of female leaders within workplaces really, really restrict women from vying for positions outside of where they are. So, for women to grow within companies, it becomes very, very difficult because they don't see a role model. वही वाली फिर गैरत वाली जो आपने बात की बहुत अच्छी, वो आ जाती है कि जो आदमी हैं वो चाय पे भी चले जाते हैं, ढाबे पे वो सिगरेट पी लेते हैं, वो नमाज के लिए भी जाते हैं, वो जुम्मे के लिए भी जाते हैं, बट ख़वातीन के पास वो नेटवर्क्स का एक्सेस ही नहीं है, तो वो दे कैन they find it very, very difficult to grow upwards within the organizations. And the double binds that if you're a woman, you have to be nice, but you can't be assertive, but if you're assertive, then you're bossy, but if you're bossy, then you're not a woman. This cyclical argument, it's so difficult to explain even when you're talking to HR managers and CEOs. So, the second generation biases wali jo bit hai, I think companies need to do more. I think as researchers, all of us, as people who work in companies, we need to do more to kind of mainstream women within the workforce. And very interesting finding, or a very interesting thing that I always look for when I go to any office is how many cubicles do they have in the female bathroom versus how many they have in the male. And you would be surprised to know that even Serena Islamabad has more cubicles in the male bathroom than it does in the female. So that just shows कि जो design जब कर रहे हैं लोग, उस design में patriarchy है, उस design में there's some design principles, in places which discriminate against women or provide less for women, which makes it harder. I was having a conversation with a friend of mine who's working with some government agencies to see why women aren't growing, and he said that a joint secretary told him that she goes home to use the bathroom because the bathroom isn't clean enough. So, I mean, these are also things that, really need to be focused on. And फिर design के साथ ही मैं छलांग मार के आती हूँ, मरियम आपके और हादिया आपके paper में. I mean, I think, again, your paper was very intuitive and it made a lot of sense, but what I had never seen put together, and I don't know if you guys have read the paper, and these guys didn't put it as a headline, I don't know why, but what their paper showed, which was really sort of, not commonsensical, was that the women who had more mobility were the ones that were trading off digital. So they were saying for us to be mobile and for our husbands and family members to not do shak on us, so that since we're going out, we will not carry a mobile. Now that is something that is really non-commonsensical. I did not expect that, even though I've worked with gender for all of my life now. But anyway, so that was really interesting, and I mean that they were consciously making that choice. They were letting go of a piece of access, or they were letting go of an access to a greater thing, so that they were less questions asked about who they were meeting and where they were going. And commonsensically you say, कि अगर बच्चा भी कहीं जा रहा होता है तो आप उसको मोबाइल दे देते हो कि यार I want to know where you are. So if you have more mobility and you're a woman and you're living in a patriarchal society, with more mobility, it's safer to actually have a mobile phone. But your research, of course, showed otherwise. So that was really interesting. And that kind of then goes into the design of things and, the questions that come up on design. And I think some of them, based on class, Rabia already kind of talked about, and you spoke about them too. But also, when we're looking at the design of technology, what we see is that use cases of technology for women are very, very rare. So when there aren't any use cases, how will women adopt that technology, right? And yes, sometimes, as one of your researchers with a great institution showed, I used to work at Kashfa. So one of your sort of researchers showed was that, once you force them into adoption, there were use cases, but I think the design of those use cases is really, really important, and that design is missing. And when we look at design, again, STEM mein khawateen kam hai, so, you're not thinking from a woman's perspective. फिर दूसरी चीज़ ये कि it's coming from a Western individualistic sort of behavior, where privacy means something very, very different as opposed to what privacy means in the context of Pakistan or in the context of the subcontinent and South Asia broadly, So those design things, I think, are extremely important to create the use cases for adoption. And I know some of the very interesting work that Maryam's been doing, and some of it she mentioned. So design is very important. So whether you're designing HR policies so that you can create motivators for women that come from institutions, I work here because this institution is great, was not one of the things that apparently you guys heard, or whether you're looking at design in terms of creating technology that women can use, because once women will use that technology, only then will they be able to gain the benefit of it. So those are just some of my points.
Thank you, Zainab. Ji, Maria?
So before I give it to Mari, sorry, I'm just going to take a minute and put on my teaching hat and just talk about gender design for 1 minute, because Zainab talked about it a lot. I'm just going to give you an example so you can kind of imagine what we mean when we're talking about gender design, when we talk about considerations for gender design. How many of you have used Google Maps? Put your hand up, loud and proud. Okay. I use Google Maps a lot when I moved to Pakistan 5 years ago, because मैं लाहौर की सड़कें भूल गई थी और लाहौर बहुत बदल चुका है पिछले 15 सालों में. How many of you have gotten lost on Google Maps? And for me this happened quite often, because वो मुझे बहुत सुनसान गलियों से लेकर जाता था और रात को. And as a woman, it was quite terrifying. How many of you have experienced that? The terror of being lost because you've been following Google Maps and you're in a city you don't know, and raat ka waqt hai, right? Now, as a technologist, I know Google Maps knows I'm a woman, right? Because it's linked to my Gmail account. It knows meri location Pakistan hai. It knows raat ke 11 baj rahe hain. And so it's not, and it knows also कि अगर मैंने A to B जाना है, उसके दौरान किन सड़कों पर कौन सी चौड़ी सड़कें हैं, किन सड़कों पर रश है, किन सड़कों पर लाइट है, कौन सी रेजिडेंशियल सड़कें हैं, कौन सी सड़कें कमर्शियल हैं, दुकानें हैं, जहाँ पर दुकानें हैं वहाँ पर रश ज़्यादा होगा, दुकानें लेट तक खुली. It has all this information, but it doesn't allow me to choose. It's a very male mindset. It'll get you from A to B in the fastest possible way, not the safest possible way. And it has all the parameters and the metrics to get you from A to B, to give you the option. कि देखो मरियम, रात के 11 बज रहे हैं, you're a woman and you're in Pakistan. So maybe you want to take the safest path. Would you like to choose the safest path? But it doesn't give me that option. So when we talk about gender design and considerations for gender design, that's the kind of thing we're talking about.
So thank you so much for inviting me here. This has been such a wonderful, just listening to all of you. So I work in the gender and financial inclusion space, somehow. Don't ask me how. Somehow. And what I've seen is talking about design is that most of these big apps that we use or technology that we use is coming from the global north. As Zainab said, their idea of privacy is very different from our idea of privacy. Those in the global south are just passive users. We are just consumers of it. When we, in financial inclusion again, working at fintechs, I've worked with 2 so far and spoken to several. What we see is everyone saying tech has no bias. Businesses are not biased. They just want to make money. That's all they care about. It doesn't matter whether you're male or female. Then they come in and say, I made something, it works great for the men. Let's now try and bring financial inclusion into it for the gender. They have made something for men. Now they forcefully want to fit women into it. And then they're like, women just don't want this product. Women are not interested in fintechs and using these digital wallets, et cetera. We have to be gender intentional. This is what we see, for example. I can give you just one example, sadly. But in Pakistan, we have a company called Udaan. It's a digital Rosca play, right? So committee or the kitties that we talk about. They have 180,000 registered users, of which 70% are actively using it, and these are primarily women, more than 90% women. How are these women using it, and why are they using this? Because this was made keeping in mind the women. How do Pakistani women save? They don't save in a bank account. They don't save by buying property. They don't have those kind of means. Those are very privileged people. How Pakistani women save is through these committees. One of the big reasons is that they have more agency over this money than any money they'll save otherwise. Why? Because this is money they have saved from whatever their husband or father or brother, whatever, has given them. And they just, for their running the house, and they just take out a little portion and invest it, save it somewhere. And when it comes out, there's another woman at the other end taking care of it, and she comes and gives them the money, and that money remains with that woman to do with what she pleases. And we know when women save, they use their money, their investment on their households, on their children mostly, and then on communities next. So we need to get more gender intentional and think about and make an honest effort. This has to be sincere. You cannot bring me a product and say, well, women are not going to use it because we have tried. No, did you think about the women when you were designing it? Well, it works in Kenya. That's another continent. The culture, the conditions, completely different. This is Pakistan, completely different context. It's not going to work here just because it worked in Tanzania or in Kenya or wherever. So that is really important. The other thing that I really liked was when you said the research was conducted outside of the big cities, Karachi, Lahore, Islamabad. I'm from Peshawar, and I always thought that it wasn't such a huge city, but I'm always snubbed that it had like so many million people living in it. How can you say that we have a McDonald's and Pizza Hut, right? But coming from South Waziristan agency background and growing up in Peshawar, working outside the house was a complete no. There were no women working outside. Mental health is what gave me permission to actually work. And then I was crafty enough to navigate that and get into something else. But yeah, so that works. And then the piece about, harassment. It's not just in small cities. I've experienced it in big cities, people that are like at the highest of the highest position that they can get to, people with who are foreign qualified. And it's not just as simple as somebody touched me. That you can make a noise about. Somebody made me uncomfortable by the way that they were looking at me. What do you say to that? I mean, it's very hard to prove. You can never prove it. And they'll just say, you're sick, for even thinking that. So there's harassment faced by women at every level, even at mine. I mean, I'm 40 plus and I've been around for ages. This is why when I came out and I started working outside, I had to completely give away my gender and say, okay, I'm going to wear joggers. I wore joggers for like 15 years of my working life, no makeup. Simplest of clothes, would just put on whatever was there, whatever somebody had given me or made for me, I would just do that. Because the way to protect myself and be taken seriously was if I just gave up my femininity, right? It took me a long time and my hair to go gray to say, okay, I think now I can relax. Still shouldn't relax too much. So all of these things exist, and it's not only in the smaller cities. I know that's who we're talking about, but in my privilege, I've only worked with like women entrepreneurs in these big cities and women although with Kashf, thanks to Zainab and her team, we did go to places like Chungi Amar Sidhu, we went to Kana, we went to Chowk Yatim Khana that in my privilege didn't even know existed anywhere, and we met all kinds of women. So women from those areas, plus women with privilege, with masters and bachelors, all of that, and women from very affluent families, met with all of them. The challenges are the same. It's funny. When I came out of Peshawar, I thought because these women dress differently than how we dress in Peshawar, they have so much empowerment. They don't have to wear a veil. They don't have to do this. They are driving cars. But when you start talking to them, the problems are the same. And this is not just in Pakistan, it's everywhere. Even abroad, I've spoken to friends abroad in the US and everywhere. They still face it. So it's not just a Pakistan problem, but yes, in the Pakistani context, maybe we can find ways. I know Dr. Maryam is working very hard on it, and she'll find a way to get it into our public transport system, and all the others who are doing such fantastic work with their research. I'm really looking forward to the solutions to these problems. Thank you.
So
Can I just add one thing on Iran? So I was actually in a meeting with Iran a couple of weeks back, and the interesting thing that Halima was basically telling me, they were trying to scale up something. So anyway, that conversation is not important. The important thing was, the ideas that I was giving them. They were like, yeah, but the thing is that they don't want their husbands to know that they're saving with us, because we were looking at checking. There are some women, of course, that default. Yes, there are women who default. But so we were trying to see, how we could reduce that and things. And so, again, and so because they're so centered on the female-centered design, the women-centered design, they were like, Dekho, I'm willing to let go of like an X% if you can help me calculate what that X% of my money is for the design to be women-centric. Because they don't want their husbands to know, because what's going to happen is A, they're not going to save in this anymore, and B, our whole purpose of doing this is to kind of make it women-centric. So yeah, a very good example. I actually really like Quran.
That's actually something a couple of years ago we spoke to. I did this project with Karandaaz funded it, and we spoke to a lot of micro-entrepreneur women, and that was the thing that came out. We were interested in how they were saving money. दो तरीके थे. या तो नेबरहुड में कोई बेवा या डिवोर्स्ड औरत बूढ़ी जिसके पास वो रखवा रहे थे, या वो कमिटियाँ डाल रहे थे, रॉस्काज डाल रहे थे, और वो दोनों मैकेनिज्म्स सीक्रेट थे, हिडन थे, और जो रॉस्काज हैं वो मल्टीपल डाले हुए थे, कोई 200 का, कोई 300 का, कोई 400 का, और घर को नहीं पता था, और जब वो आता था तो वो कोई टैंजिबल चीज़ फ़ौरन ख़रीद लेते थे, कोई गोल्ड ले लिया या कोई बर्तन ले लिए, कपड़े ले लिए, और कहानी बना दी कि इसके पैसे कहाँ से आए, कि ये मेरी बहन का है, उसने रखवाया है, मेरा नहीं है, राइट? Because they knew that if the cash stayed as cash, it would be used in the household, फजूल चीज़ों में, they would have no autonomy over it, and this was all hidden. And when we asked them कि आप mobile wallets क्यों नहीं use कर रहे हैं, and this goes back to what Zainab was saying earlier, they were very clear. They said हमने easy पैसा, jazz cash सब कुछ try किया, लेकिन जो चीज़ मैं छुपाना चाह रही हूँ वो उसको अपीयर कर रहा है, उसको ट्रांसपेरेंट कर रहा है, मेरे फ़ोन पर आ रहा है, जो मेरा मियाँ देख रहा है, एंड इसमें मैं थिएटर टिकट्स लूँगी, मैं सिनेमा तो नहीं जा रही ना, उसका यूज़ केस क्या है? मेरा बच्चा लम्स नहीं जाता है, मैं उसकी फ़ी नहीं पे उसमें करूँगी. So there are no use cases, and then it doesn't understand the ways in which I'm hiding money, and so I have no use case for it.
Thank you. On that, we'll open up to the audience for questions. Ji.
Thank you so much to all of you. I'm a film person, so I'm coming from a different perspective, but I was actually just thinking, you were talking about harassment and you were talking about the commute. And how so much of the commute in films, the meet cute, that public space is through harassment, right? It's that moment when a girl is teased or someone, and it's almost all in waiting for the bus or in the bus or in a public space. And so this kind of idea, which is reinforced, romanticized through this meeting, but it is reinforced both in the real world and the real world on screen as well, and oftentimes linked to women who have to take public spaces, who have to take the bus, or women in their cars are much more protected from this kind of harassment, and therefore meet in schools where there isn't harassment of that type. You know, that's a suggestion that there's a particular type of harassment that exists depending on what kind of transport you take, is something that's highlighted on screen, as well as whether it's our dramas or whether it's our. So when you were talking about the global south or the global north, this concept in my mind, I kept on imagining all the meet cutes taking place in the public, all starting with that one, like that staring, oftentimes with that staring in the public space. So thank you so much. You give me a lot to think about in my own research as well. Thank you.
Ji.
Hi, Assalamu alaikum. I'm coming from a different background in cultural heritage and public spaces, but my question is about female empowerment in inheritance rights. Are we working on technology and bringing inclusiveness and bringing rights to women from any sector of family dynamics? Because when technology is there and when women empowerment is there, do they know about their rights? Because as women from any family setup, whether it's poor or whether it's rich, we all let go of our human rights when it comes about inheritance rights. So are we working on that and empowering that? Thank you.
So my take on technology after 5-6 years of working in Pakistan, and I've spoken to women across the board, has changed drastically. Because मेरी सारी training West की है. And so I came at it from that perspective, right? And after you work in Pakistan for any amount of time, you very quickly realize technology is just an amplifier. वो fundamentally चीज़ों को नहीं बदलती. What it does is it amplifies what's already there. And we saw this most prominently during COVID. The difference between those who had access to tech and those who didn't, it just amplified existing class, gender differences, right? So if you were somebody who was rich and had access to tech, then you were online schooling. अगर आप already ही public school में जा रहे थे, तो फिर your education just went worse, right? Gender operates in the same way, right? So I don't think technology fundamentally is there to change anything, right? I think it's a tool. जो आपकी underlying जो कुछ भी है, वो उसको amplify करेगा. अगर आप LUMS से belong करते हो, तो आप ट्विटर पर भी हो और आपको इंग्लिश भी आती है, तो योर एक्सेस टू ग्रेड स्कूल्स इज़ गोइंग टू बी सिग्निफिकेंटली मोर, योर एक्सेस टू जॉब्स इज़ गोइंग टू बी मोर, योर नेटवर्क इज़ गोइंग टू बी ब्रॉडर. अगर आप किसी गवर्नमेंट स्कूल से हो और आपकी अंग्रेज़ी इतनी अच्छी नहीं है और आपको नहीं पता किन लोगों को फॉलो करना है, तो वो जो गैप है वो और बढ़ता चला जाएगा. दैट्स ऑल दैट टेक डज. दिस इज़ माई अंडरस्टैंडिंग ऑफ व्हाट टेक डज. सो फंडामेंटली टेक्नोलॉजी इटसेल्फ कैन नॉट गिव यू एनी राइट्स. What it can do is, if you inherently want change, it can give you access to resources and tools and communities that can help you get those rights. And we've sort of seen that take place in, I don't know if you're aware, but one of the biggest, I think, shifting things for women has been closed Facebook groups. So you have these communities of women that are closed, closely monitored. Usme, the moderators ensure कि कोई मर ना आए. And it also speaks to, it's in earlier work, what you were talking about, Rabia. Dr. Kamal actually said that, women sometimes will give in to patriarchal norms to carve out more agency for themselves. And you see this particularly because, we spoke to a lot of these moderators of closed women-only groups. And unme se ek jo thi, their name and their description was very clearly very feminist, right? And they wanted to reclaim the digital space as their own. And they kept getting shut down because en masse, hundreds of men would start reporting that group. But then there was another moderator of a group, jisme lakhon auratein hain, and they've never been shut down. And I asked what they did, and they said, we project ourselves to the outside world as a mothering group. So as far as our men know, hum ek dusre ko achhi maaye banna sikha rahe hain. Right? Lekin andar we have lawyers and doctors, and we're giving women advice on inheritance rights and on divorce, and we're helping them get access to jobs, and we're helping them figure out how to leave abusive marriages. So I think women, when they want to make that change, the internet and technology gives them access to resources that helps them do it. In and of itself, I don't think it's going to do anything.
Ji.
There is also one thing I do know about inheritance is that
and then Dr. Zainab.
Oh, of course.
After you.
So there's a law by the government now. So if say a father figure in the family passes away and their sibling, children and the wife and all that, NADRA will not let you, or the development authority of that city will not let you do anything with the property unless all of the people or in the family who have a right to that property present themselves at the same time in that office. So just recently went through it. So one thing that one government, I won't name names, otherwise it gets political, has done right is this: they have made sure of inheritance rights. Of course, they can be coerced, women can be threatened and all of that. But yeah, technology-wise or the government or policy-wise, it's there.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, absolutely following up on what Maryam said, it can't really solve a problem, technology necessarily in this particular case. But I think what your question points to a bigger issue, which is around how the legal system is adopting or not adopting digital technology. And in our case, I think that it's perhaps of all the institutions, this is perhaps one of the slowest, which is not, surprising. But awareness-raising initiatives are, many. You can find that information, you can find advice. But if you actually want to go to court, then unfortunately it's your legs and feet and your persistence that is going to help you and not your phone.
Just on that, I was recently judging a business planning competition for EO, and there was a boy who was using AI to use case law. So you write, and his business was that you write your question, AI goes through all of the case law, and it says that these are the relevant things. And this is what the precedent is. And then they go to, so you can book a lawyer from that solution that he had, and then you can tell the lawyer, okay, this is what the laws are. How do I make them go in my favor? So I mean, it's a small model that he's done, and he wants to he has big plans for it. So I mean, that's one thing that I recently found out about. So there is AI and the technology and AI and what is existing and how AI can then now go through that case law and make it easier.
And a technologist working on AI, that's very problematic. Super. We're not getting into this, but please don't do this. This is super problematic.
It refers you to a lawyer, though. But Monas was also saying Monas was like, "Ye kya hai?" I was like, "Hey, acha."
Ji, Zahra.
I'd like to make a very small comment on harassment, design, naumidi. डेवलपमेंट सेक्टर हम लोगों में से काफ़ी लोग डेवलपमेंट सेक्टर में से हैं, तो एक वो पर्सनली हिट होता है जब हरासमेंट की पॉलिसीज़ इस्तेमाल नहीं होती, हमारी जो फेलो ख़वातीन हैं उनको हरासमेंट हो रही होती है. सो एक इंटरेस्टिंग चीज़ जो हमारी रिसर्च के अंदर हमें दिखी कि डिज़ाइन के ज़रिए से आप ख़वातीन को सेग्रीगेट भी कर दो और उनको कंफर्टेबल भी फील कराओ, लेकिन एट द एंड ऑफ द डे यू आर गोइंग टू एग्जिट द सेम बिल्डिंग. सो वी हैड रिपोर्ट्स ऑफ cases where a woman respondent shifted from a development sector to the government sector, and it was a very prestigious job. However, she realized that whenever she stepped out, 5 बज गए घर से काम से बाहर निकलिए घर जाने के लिए, उन्हीं के colleagues उनको harass कर रहे थे. So it's नाउमीदी social sector में भी है, development sector में भी है, लेकिन design is also, फिर आप उस तरह भी नहीं कर सकते कि मर्दों और ख़वातीन के exits बिल्कुल ही अलग कर दो. So I feel like everything that people contributed to the conversation on design is very interesting, and I'm very happy that both of these papers were put together, because I feel like design really brings both together.
Right, so I'll ask our panelists to give final thoughts. You can think about it in terms of policy, you can link the discussion that we've had. So I'll ask everyone to do quick 30-second final thoughts. Let's start with you, Zahra.
Oh, I thought we were doing Discussants. Oh, well, those were my thoughts.
Right.
Okay.
Dr. Zainab.
No, my final thoughts would definitely be the same that I concluded the presentation with. These are solvable problems, and I think the potential to focus on the small towns, what I am calling small town Pakistan, or what we think is not Lahore and Islamabad and Karachi, I think the potential of solving problems there, finding design solutions that focus on that context, and it's not a one-size-fits-all. I think that's what this research is telling us. The potential is immense. So we're very hopeful at the end of our research.
I think in terms of the 30 seconds that I have, I think the male champions of change, the male champion point is something that really resonates. So you talked about male champions within the household. I think there has to be a shift of creating those male champions outside. There was mention of male champions trying to, stop harassment when it is being reported. But, within organizations, within offices, you need to also create awareness on harassment for men. I think one of the things जो अभी आपने की ना separate but equal, वो separate but equal नहीं होता. So इसके अंदर ये भी बहुत ज़रूरी है कि you need to get men in tech to think about women's solutions and how things are not relevant for women, but also men in the general workforce to become the male champions that can actually say okay, in our office harassment doesn't happen. And I used to work for an organization that was able to do that. I mean 4,200 employees, 50% of them women, 50% women at every tier. So it is possible. It's not impossible, like you said, Dr. Zainab, but it takes a lot of orientation to the mission and like a constant reiteration, because whatever you may have inside the office, the minute they go out, there's patriarchy that hits them, right? And there's all sorts of harassment and all kinds of things that hit them. And with harassment, the issue is that people don't feel safe reporting harassment, and I think that was highlighted in your paper also. So, जो पंचायत वाली आपने बात की थी कि एक पंचायत बैठती है कि क्या मैं काम भी कर सकती हूँ कि नहीं, तो जब हरासमेंट मैंने रिपोर्ट की ना, तो अब उस पंचायत ने इस पे भी डिसीजन लेना है कि अच्छा यार हमने आपको अलाउ तो कर दिया था, लेकिन अब तो आपने ये भी बताया कि हरासमेंट पे होती है, तो अब उस पंचायत ने रिकन्वीन करना है और उसने कहना है कि नाउ विद द न्यू इन्फॉर्मेशन वी हैव टू नाउ डिसाइड वेदर आप काम कर सकती हो कि नहीं कर सकती. So so harassment, the ability to report harassment and then the ability to deal with when harassment is reported within an office is also very important, which will require both genders. So I mean, this can't be a woman's battle. This has to be a societal battle. Men and women both need to kind of work on it.
Thank you, Zainab. And that kind of sums up my thoughts on this as well. I want to sort of emphasize, I don't think technology fundamentally changes things, right? The goal should be looking at how do we leverage tech to change societal norms. And वो एक gender से change नहीं होते. You kind of need to take everybody. And I think the other thing that if you do this long enough, you start to recognize that often with men, it's not a binary. It's not that, we're at war with each other. That's not what it is. Often it's just ignorance. It's not malice, often. Very often it's ignorance. And this is something that older women recognize in the community. इसीलिए वो फिर शोर मचाती हैं. And they gather people around them. And अगर औरत के पास phone नहीं है, तो उस bus stop पर या उस bus के अंदर मर्दों के पास है. And so leveraging what you know exists, leveraging what you know works, and getting women to design for themselves, I think, is a key point for me, right? I, as somebody who's very privileged, who uses my own private transport, have complete agency autonomy, I come from a place of great privilege. I do not have solutions for the bulk of the women that live and work in Pakistan, because मेरा working environment LUMS है, right? So I graduated from LUMS and I came back and I started working here. So I cannot be the designer for the bulk of the women in Pakistan. All I can do is give them the tools to design for themselves. And to create designs and be thoughtful in how we think about designs from both gendered perspectives, right? How many men here have used Careem or Uber? Men. How many men here have used any form of Careem, Uber, InDriver? So quite a few. जब आप wait कर रहे होते हैं, if on your phone you get a story of another woman who's either used Careem, Uber or public transport, और उसके साथ उसमें क्या हुआ, would that raise your awareness of what's happening around you when you are in a Careem or a public transport? Right? So there are, in how we use existing tech, I find, there are these key points that you can leverage to raise awareness without taking a hammer to somebody's head and saying कि देखो ये औरतों के साथ क्या होता है, कितनी बुरी बात होती है. पर आपने Careem बुक की, आप बस पर खड़े हैं, आपके फ़ोन को आपकी लोकेशन का पता है कि आप बस स्टॉप पर खड़े हैं और बस का इंतज़ार कर रहे हैं, राइट? आपको अगर एक अलर्ट आता है कि ओ पिछले हफ्ते इसी बस स्टॉप पर एक औरत के साथ क्या हुआ, अब इसमें औरतों को पास एक मैकेनिज्म है टू नरेट देयर स्टोरीज, वो स्टोरीज एक आर्काइव में जा रही हैं एंड दे आर कमिंग बैक टू यू, सो यू आर अवेयर, बिकॉज आई फाइंड अ लॉट ऑफ दिस is ignorance, right? It's not understanding what's happening on the other end of the aisle. And I think technology can absolutely be leveraged for social and economic empowerment, but in a very thoughtful, participatory design mechanism, so that it's not a top-down approach. It's not somebody sitting in Silicon Valley making an app and then saying कि आप इसको इस्तेमाल करें, right? Because clearly that we know that's not going to work.
Thank you. Just a few points. So I think one of the, just drawing off what Dr. Maryam just said, I think sometimes it certainly is ignorance or this idea that I might know what's going on, but there's not much I can do about it, right? Like the bystander effect that we've discussed a few times as well. So I think there's that. I think the second thing that's really important to keep in mind is when we're talking about harassment and the commute that, or even online spaces, that women, just as much as men, perpetuate harassment and patriarchy and all of those things. So I think, again, this kind of false binary between men as perpetrators and women as victims is something that we need to constantly challenge. I think third, I think when we're talking about women in these smaller towns, villages, et cetera, that we really, again, need to be incredibly thoughtful about the intersection of class and gender and the rural-urban divide or whatever in terms of how we approach solutions. And then finally, I would just say, again, resonating with what Dr. Maryam said, that I think we need to be very cautious about this notion that technology can solve problems or that AI is a great way to, because again, AI, there's so many issues that I think erases the sort of easy way to fix things or access things. So I think that would be my sort of few points. Thank you.
For me, the most important thing is there's strength in number. So women and men need to rally together and work together to stop these negative, activities, for lack of a better word. And yeah, so you need to work together. I'm very optimistic. The other thing I would request you to do is please don't ask your sisters or daughters or whoever your students, don't do this, don't go out at this time, don't work in this environment, show them how to navigate that space. You will figure it out. But the more that you keep them, protected and, away from these kind of social experiences that they will have, no matter how protected you keep them, and wherever you send them to work, it will happen. Please send them on a bus. Please have them take a Chinchi ride. Please send them to Shalimar Bagh on an orange train. I did it with my daughter. Please help them navigate these spaces, and while you're doing it, make sure it's not just the girls you're telling this to, you're also telling the boys. So that's all I can say for harassment. I don't know how this ended up being a harassment conversation, but yeah, that's all I would say. Thank you.
All right, thank you. So thank you very much to all of our wonderful panelists, and it was so nice when everyone came here and sat down to see these wonderful, strong women. I loved the panel. And thank you to the audience.
Thank you, Hadia. Thank you, Hadia.
Thank you.